Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks' plan for the upcoming trade deadline. Now, what's most interesting about this season is that compared to the previous 2 years that I've been covering the San Jose Sharks, this upcoming trade deadline is a lot more sort of murky. Now, in the past couple of years, I've had names put up onto the whiteboard that I've outlined of who the Sharks were targeting or who the Sharks might be selling, and that was because it was extremely straightforward. If, let's say, in the 18-19 season, the Sharks were very clearly trying to compete for a Stanley Cup. They were absolutely going to make the playoffs that season, and so I outlined a bunch of the players that were expected to be rental pieces at the deadline that the Sharks could try and target and could try and pick up, and in the end the Sharks ended up going for Gustav Nyquist. In the 1920 season, the Sharks were squarely out of a playoff spot, and it was obvious the Sharks were going to be sellers at the deadline, and so I essentially just outlined all of the unrestricted free agent contracts from the Sharks' perspective and said that, they'd probably end up moving most of them, including players like Brendan Dillon or Patrick Marleau. Come this season, however, the Sharks are not buyers because they may not even make the playoffs, and even if they do, they are not necessarily competitive for a Stanley Cup, so there's no reason to try and pick up any sort of rental player by giving away actual assets, and yet the Sharks also aren't necessarily sellers because they're only within a few points of a playoff spot, so the Sharks don't necessarily want to completely unload all of their unrestricted free agent contracts. Because obviously the end goal for the season, even if many people think that the Sharks should rebuild, the end goal should be to make the playoffs this season. And so even considering that, the only real unrestricted free agents that the Sharks could potentially move at the deadline were going to be the three of Marcus Sorensen, Patrick Marleau, and Devan Dubnyk. Any other unrestricted free agent that the Sharks have at the end of this season is probably barely even worth putting on waivers. Players like Stefan Noesen or Frederick Handemark are players that the Sharks could get basically zero value out of if they tried to trade them. And any other player is either just not really worth trading at this point or is impossible to move mid-season. I know there were a lot of people, especially when people were committed to the Sharks going for this full rebuild, a lot of people thought that the Sharks could even trade players like Hertl, LeBanc, or Meyer. Now, not only are those contracts essentially unmovable during the season, though the postseason is a different question, but also because that since the Sharks are going to try and make the playoffs, they can't trade away any of their actual good players to be able to do so. So anything like that is completely off the table unless some crazy value deal does come along. So that indeed does just leave Sorensen, Marleau, and Devan Dubnyk. And these were really the three players who the Sharks, or many people thought that the Sharks would attempt to move at this deadline, but because they are within just a few points of a playoff spot, for a player like Devan Dubnyk, for instance, the Sharks were probably fine with just having Martin Jones as their starter and bringing up some random goaltender like maybe Melnichuk to play as the Sharks' backup, or someone like Coronar to play as the Sharks' backup for the rest of the season. However, if the Sharks are going to be making that playoff push, and considering they have a lot of back-to-back games still left on their schedule, they probably do want to keep a more sort of settled in and consistent backup compared to going with someone who they don't really know what to expect from in one of the two AHL goaltenders the Sharks do have. And so Dubnyk seemed to be an option for teams like the Avalanche or teams like the Capitals just a few weeks ago, and yet now it seems as though the Sharks may in fact just keep him in the lineup for the rest of this season. The same would sort of go with Patrick Marleau. Obviously, the cynic in me says that Patrick Marleau just isn't really worth much of anything. I pointed out that a player like Noesen may as well just be waived because the Sharks would get zero value for him at the deadline. Patrick Marleau, I won't say the Sharks are going to waive him, absolutely not, but I'm saying that I don't think there's any team like there was a team last season with the Pittsburgh Penguins who are actually going to be willing to give up real value to pick up Patrick Marleau. At this point, Marleau is nothing better than a fourth liner, and the thing is that Marleau has so much legacy behind him and so much respect earned from the league that if you do pick up a player like Marleau, especially with how things are going this season and trying to break records, you essentially are forced to play him every single game. So does a team want to pick up a fourth liner who they need to play essentially every single game? I don't know. And it was said that the Sharks could try and trade Marleau to give him one last chance at the Stanley Cup, but if the Sharks are actually going to make the playoffs, while obviously they're not going to have as high a chance of winning the Stanley Cup as a team like the Avalanche or the Golden Knights or the Capitals or the Islanders or whoever, the fact that the Sharks can still make the playoffs might be enough to keep Marleau in San Jose. Meaning the only real player who I could see the Sharks actually moving at this deadline would be Marcus Sorensen, and it seems much more likely considering the fact in the previous Sharks game Sorensen was pulled out of the lineup to seemingly keep him from getting injured so that the Sharks could retain his value in the upcoming days before the deadline. And yet, even saying that, it's not as though Marcus Sorensen is going to pull such a massive amount of value. I would be surprised if he got anything more than a third-round pick. We saw the Sharks actually make a pretty solid deal for themselves last season, where they traded Barclay Goodrow and a third-rounder to upgrade essentially to a first-rounder from the Tampa Bay Lightning. And I think Goodrow offered up a lot more intangible values for the Tampa Bay Lightning than a player like Marcus Sorensen does. Sorensen is technically a penalty killer like Goodrow was, but I don't think he's as effective of a player as Goodrow was, or even as clutch of a player as Goodrow was. And so, in fact, I don't think any first-round pick is on the table. I don't even think any second-round pick is on the table. And as I said, a third-round pick would be about what I was expecting. And so, essentially, it would not be much of a surprise to see maybe that Sorensen trade happen, but otherwise the Sharks staying completely still at the deadline and sort of just letting the last few games of the season play out. It should also be noted that this does somewhat depend on how these final couple of games before the deadline comes on Mondays do go. The Sharks have 2 games still remaining before the deadline passes. Those are 2 games against the Los Angeles Kings on Friday and Saturday. If the Sharks win both of those games, they find themselves just within a single point of the Coyotes, who were losers last night, and a couple points ahead of the St. Louis Blues, obviously discounting the fact that these two teams are going to still be playing games at the same time as the Sharks are playing games, and would find themselves 6 points ahead of the Kings, meaning the Sharks would be very squarely in the playoff race and have a very good chance at getting that 4th place spot. However, if the Sharks lose those next couple of games, they'll find themselves even behind the Los Angeles Kings, much further behind the Coyotes, and also behind the St. Louis Blues, which will make it much more difficult for the Sharks to actually make the playoffs at that point, with only about just over a dozen games remaining on the schedule. So in a situation like that, the Sharks might be a bit more willing to try and be a bit bigger sellers at the deadline. Now, besides buying and besides selling, there is something else that the Sharks could do at the deadline that some people have been talking about, and even Doug Wilson has mentioned, which is the fact that the Sharks do actually have a decent bit of cap space open for themselves at this year's deadline, about $2.5 million, which may not seem like a lot, but considering that the vast majority of the NHL teams right now are basically right up against the cap within not just, a couple million, but a couple $1,000, means that a lot of these teams that might be looking to add players at the deadline might need to first unload some contracts, or let's say do a 3-way trade with a team that they can unload contracts to and still have to give up assets to them. So for instance, we actually saw a trade like this earlier today, which was with the Florida Panthers and the Chicago Blackhawks, where the Panthers actually gave up a decent prospect in Borgstrom as well as Brett Connolly, just to give up that Brett Connolly contract and free themselves up some cap space to try and make a further move within the next few days at the deadline. And the Sharks could technically be an option for one of those teams to sort of give them a free asset just to take on a bad deal. However, having said that, it is extremely difficult to predict what kind of team is going to want to do that and what big contract on said team is actually going to be moved in that way. And so while buying and just covering which of a few rentals is easier to do, or just covering which of a few unrestricted free agent contracts the Sharks would be looking to sell, when it comes to this cap space situation, it is a lot more foggy, a lot more murky. And so while the Sharks can technically do something in that regard, it is going to be mostly a surprise to see what would actually end up happening over the next few days. But that will do it for this preview. I wouldn't necessarily be too excited about how the Sharks trade deadline goes over these next few days, but as I said, besides the imminent Marcus Sorensen trade that I would say has probably about an 80% chance of happening at this point, I would be rather surprised if the Sharks made any other notable move at the deadline. If anything else, it's maybe a minor league swap of something like that, or maybe trading a player for like a 6th round pick. Otherwise, the next few days, it'll basically just be that chase for a playoff spot, and then finally for the last month or so of the year, and we'll see how the Sharks can potentially do with this basic group of guys in the playoffs if they can make it. Class dismissed.